All right, it is North Dakota round 2. I was out here opening week and we brought Sam. She got her first deer. The tether crew was out here. They all did really well. I did not draw back on a deer, but I'm back out here to see if I can fill a late season tag. There's a little bit of snow on the ground, as you can tell, which is making tracks really obvious, even driving some of these roads. I mean, you can go just miles and miles and it's dead. But then when you find where there's a concentration of deer, it's really obvious. And so really what I'm trying to find is to see if I can find some kind of a gold mine food source. Maybe it's even on private land, but it's adjacent to public and the deer are either passing through public or they're bedding on public. And I can figure out a way to get in there and basically cut them off on the way to some of those food sources. And I was curious and hoping to see if there'd be any standing crops, standing corn, standing beans, if there were still any sugar beets in the ground or any canola that was still there. But for the most part, I think I've seen like one standing cornfield since driving across the state lines. It's mostly all picked. Really today, as day one, is just an intel day. I'm driving around, putting a lot of miles on the truck. Some of the pieces of public are landlocked, and I'm trying to figure out, is there posted signs around it, or would I be able to potentially access those pieces of public? I'm also trying to figure out, once again, can I see deer sign from the roads? There's going to be some places tomorrow and throughout the week that I'll probably just get out on foot and have to just verify, because obviously not everything's going to be visible from the road. And certainly these deer are definitely afraid of vehicles, it seems like. Whenever I've seen deer in fields, they are booking it to get back to some semblance of cover. It's also really important today that I'm getting some of this intel and finding where some of these clusters of deer are located, because we're supposed to get some snow tomorrow and that might cover up some of those tracks. So I'm trying to learn as much as I can now before that happens. I've seen some deer that are on public, all does. I've seen some deer that are on private, all does. And so we'll see how it goes. And here we'll talk about just the other part of the equation, which is not just looking at the sign, but also just kind of getting a feel for how the deer movement could be on this trip. So we can see the weather starts out, pretty much as cold as it's going to be, stays pretty consistent, and then warms up throughout the weekend and into the following week. And then as we scroll down here to the prediction, you can see the transition area movement, which is, kind of middle of the road between core area and full range. And it's going to be like that for the first several days, and then again, kind of corresponding to that more mild warm up, you get that core area movement toward the latter half of the week there. So certainly from this, it seems like my best opportunities from a movement perspective are probably going to be earlier, getting worse as the trip goes on. It also means that I'm probably more likely the later half of the trip to really need to get as close as I possibly can to where some of those deer might be bedding. Compared to the historical averages for both highs and lows, a little bit above average for both of them. Predominantly over the last 2 weeks, a lot of southern winds with a little bit of northwest here and there. At the completion of yesterday's scouting, I essentially looked at the map. There's 14 locations where I had driven through and seen deer trails, defined multiple deer trails going through areas that were either public to public or public to private, and took all that intel and went back home, looked at the map at kind of a larger level to try and see, okay, where are those trails heading to and coming from? What are they likely feeding on, and where are they likely bedding? And then looked at which places I'd like to hunt on given wind directions. Today, for example, is south wind, but it's the only day we're going to have a south wind over the next several days. The rest of the trip, it's going to be like west, northwest. But what it means is that my plan for today is I'm going to get right in, be somewhat aggressive, knowing that tomorrow my south wind spots are going to be gone. And so I'll slowly take my time and kind of work back into that area. If I find a single trail with bigger tracks, I'll sit over that. If I just find general deer traffic trails, then I'll sit over those and hopefully see some numbers. Like I said, I'm not going to be too picky on this trip. So we'll see how it goes. I'm in an area where there's definitely a decent amount of deer traffic. The timber's kind of open, but there's a little strip of thicker stuff here. And some of those trails are following up through, coming from an area where it's more swampy and heading generally toward the direction of ag. I'll push a little bit further, see what it looks like, and then I may come back and hit this and hunt it. Got a couple hours of shooting light left, and I did see some pretty good rut sign on the way in here, but there's definitely trails, and this place in particular, it's got a swamp behind it, which is frozen now, but it has good lower cover. And then out behind me a ways is private ag, and you can see that there's, even though I can't see the size, you can tell that there's deer that are kind of meandering through this area to get from one to the other. The wind is in my face, but with the number of deer that could be in here or using that bedding area, I don't really want to play with it just off wind. It'd be a little too dangerous, I think. Because it's so open in general, the deer can use their eyes very well. In fact, on the way in, I did bump a couple of does that seemed like they must have just been bedding out in the open hardwoods, where they could see, 200-300 yards in every direction. So I basically just picked the spot where we had tracks and sort of the thickest travel corridor in terms of trees that I was able to find. Well, I just kept coming down, following these tracks, getting to the area that looked good on the map, and the tracks slowly kind of turned and meandered on a private. I lost when I got back to some of the stuff that looked like it could be pretty good on the map. There's not much time back here, so I'm pulling the plug on this spot. I'm gonna walk back to the truck, and it's one of two spots I'll probably hit that are pretty close to the road tonight. This is one of the reasons why I start so early, before noon, to get out for an afternoon sit in case something like this happens. I have a plan B and I have time to get to it. I ended up walking in here about half mile, just checking to see where the most travel was, and there's a decent amount of sign back here, a lot of tracks, not much digging, and it's all kind of spread out. You'll find areas where, heading toward the private ag, there might be 2 or 3 deer that are meandering through one particular pinch. But then you go another 50 yards and there's more tracks, another 50 yards, there's more tracks. So it's hard to pick like one location where they're all moving through. It seems like you got a little bit of everything. I think that deer could be bedding. There's a little point out in front of me here, and it looks a little bit brushier. The only question is whether or not I was able to sneak in here quiet enough. The woods are just absolutely still. Some of that wind we had really died off. So I just crested over this ridge. You can see there's a bed right here. Not sure if that's a day or a nighttime bed. There's another one just down there on the ridge. I was hoping that the deer would be bedded down in that swampy lower depression kind of an area. And as I just came over this ridge, there was a doe bedded about right there, right on the side of this ridge in this little knob. And I actually watched her stand up, and she stood there for a while. Eventually got too nervous, and her and another doe took off and ran down into the drainage. There's a lot of tracks around here. They're using this area pretty heavily. So the big challenge is going to be, now that I kick those two out, especially with tomorrow's wind direction, this would be a good morning setup. If I got in here and just kind of waited right here, that deer could filter through. But for this afternoon, I need to decide if I want to keep going down this direction and just sit on one of these higher ridges and hope that more deer from a different location come up out of the bottom, or do I go back in further, come around the backside, and try and get in front of some more of these deer. And then here we got an updated prediction a little bit later in the week, and you can see that as the weather has changed, it shifted a little bit warmer. The entire rest of the experience here is core area activity, so definitely not the best, and it just means once again I'm going to have to try and get as close as I possibly can. Alright, so this may be the last evening that I'm hunting. I went in and just did some walking around, some scouting a little bit earlier today, and with the wind direction and this nice cloud cover that we got, I'm going to go back to the day 2 spot. If you remember from day 2, I ended up sitting on the ground in some deadfall and did see one doe coming through, but she didn't come on one of the trails that went through that little deadfall nest that I was sitting in. She went just around it. It's a little bit warmer today. The snow is a little bit softer, a little bit quieter, which is good. I'm just going to try and sneak as close as I can. There's obviously deer using this area still. Every time I drive past this, it's like a little oxbow, and there's traffic that crosses the road. There's certainly a lot of deer sign, more so than 2 days ago. But even though this is a high traffic area, I still don't think it's quite close enough to see daylight movement. My assumption is that this is probably where I'm standing still, nighttime sign. So I'll keep pushing forward. So I had only gone 15 more yards after that last video clip, and I saw out in front of me 3 deer jumped up and ran off. And they were obviously bedded closer than I was expecting. The spot that I'm at, it's like an oxbow and river bottom, and there's private ag. And where the deer are bedded, they're maybe 150 yards from the borderline, and the oxbow still goes a ways back. So they're bedding significantly closer to where they would end up feeding than I'd like. It could be anywhere in here. Where they jumped up was where I had actually walked past 2 days ago to hunt this, and they weren't bedded there, and there was no beds in the snow there 2 days ago. So I pushed as far as I felt like I could, following the sign back. There were definitely fresh tracks, fresh trails of even the place that I hunted 2 days ago off the ground. There was more fresh tracks going right past that spot. Push back a little bit further, and it's just so open, and then you get a little bit of brush right on the edge of the river where it's the thickest cover around, and there's a few pieces of deadfall, a little ditch, and the deer definitely using this to cross over. Maybe some of these deer that are bedding further down the river, like some of the sign indicates there probably is, get up and move through, and I'll be able to see quite a long ways, obviously, but hopefully they come close enough and get near enough to this area where they would need to come through this little pinch right here, and I'd be able to get a shot. Time to start getting down. About 15 minutes ago, I did hear a stick snap. It sounded like, it must have been about 150 yards away, which is about the distance of the back of that oxbow. So very well could have been a deer moving through there, or it could have been a deer getting up out of its bed and starting to mill around. It's really tough to say for sure. But there's really just only so much you can do with the really quiet conditions right now as a mobile hunter. You can only get so close before you're at a real risk of, bumping the deer out. Had some fun on this trip. Had some opportunities I could have taken. I'll end up doing a little debrief from this video as well, just in case there's people out here who might be looking to try a hunt like this. Can hopefully get some information from the things I've learned. Okay, so a little post-hunt breakdown here. I've done the North Dakota thing now a couple of times in the first week when the deer are mostly still in their summer patterns. There's cover everywhere, there's food everywhere, and the deer are a little bit more spread out, but they're also much easier to set up on once you do find them. And now for this late season thing, it was kind of totally the opposite. You had pockets of deer, and you could go a long distance, like miles, where you don't see a deer track at all. And then you find pockets, and that's definitely where you have larger concentrations of deer. So I would say finding deer in the late season is a little bit easier, but on the flip side, even if you find the deer, it's a little bit harder to actually set up on them than it is in the early season. You can get, 50, 60 yards away from deer, not have them jump up early season, whereas late season you might be 200 yards away and they're bedded in such a way where they can see that movement coming from a long ways off. At least that's what I found quite a bit. There weren't necessarily deer bedding just on noise and cover and where they can use the wind to their advantage, but definitely sight bedding was pretty big from what I could see, and that really limited how close you could get. And those deer really had to get up early and start moving early for you to have a legitimate shot. Weather makes a big difference there too. The first day when we had the wind and we had all that snow that was coming down, that made it a lot easier to kind of sneak through the woods undetected. Whereas you contrast that to the last couple of days where it was real still and calm and quiet, it was really hard to try and get as close as I wanted to really get to where I thought some of those deer were bedding. When you think about kind of the ABCs of late season hunting, at least in the context of what you read in magazine articles, what you hear on podcasts from guys that hunt and live on these big farms, there's usually just kind of a sequence of events where number one, you find the deer, you find whatever big food source they're hitting on, and then you just sit back and observe, and then you wait until the time is right, you have the right weather conditions, a big feeding event, and then you go in and strike. But you don't necessarily have that luxury. Number one, on public land on an out-of-state trip, you might not know that you're going to have that dynamite food source to be able to find and be able to kind of sit back and observe on. Number two, these areas have just had a couple months of bow hunting pressure. They've, within the last several weeks, had the firearm season, and that seems to push them into again some of those pockets where they feel secure. A lot of times they're going to be away from roads, at least for the most part. You did see some that were within the general vicinity of roadways. But then probably the biggest thing is you can't just necessarily have the luxury to sit back and just watch for several days unless you plan on like a week-long trip, and then you're going to have several days of various wind directions. You can use that to your advantage and kind of capitalize, especially on a shorter trip like what I had here, where you have 4 days and basically 2 major wind directions. That really kind of dictates what places you're able to spend your time in. As it turned out, that first day ended up being my best opportunity. Which brings me to the last thing that I wanted to kind of touch on, is the morning versus the evening. With me just being out there kind of by myself and trying to document everything with the various cameras and the way I was running them, which was basically battery packed and just having to run continuously, it made it really logistically tough. And so what I ended up doing more in the mornings was just kind of getting out scouting, checking some more areas, looking to see if I could find a place with bigger tracks, a lot of just general deer traffic and normal track sizes that I saw. But I never really found a set of tracks that was like very obviously a mature buck. I was also checking out some of the beta testing algorithms on some of the new features for Spartan Forge that are going to be coming out in the future, which is where it kind of gives you the general idea of where high probability there could be deer bedding, there could be deer feeding, etc. And so I was checking out those to see how accurate they were. So once that's closer to being actually ready to launch, I'll be able to do more content on that. But the morning for me was mostly just letting stuff charge and going out and just covering a lot of ground. But had it not been so much of a focus on the content creation too, then I think certainly hunting in the mornings would have been beneficial, especially in a lot of these areas where it was really tough to get close to deer in the evenings. If you get set up well before first light and you just wait for those deer to filter back in, there's always the chance they come in before it's actually light enough to shoot. But in some of those cases, you can set up right over the top of where those deer are bedding, and hopefully they come back in, and even if they do bed down, you just wait till it gets light and then maybe you can get a shot. I think in general, I prefer the earlier season for this type of a hunt much more so than the late season, just because that suits my style a little bit better of that mobile hunting and getting really close to where you have bedded deer to give you the maximum opportunity that you can go ahead and get a shot, that those deer come out and move before dark. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Even though there wasn't a kill, I wanted to try and at least make sure there was enough content here that you might be able to learn something from it. So let me know what you guys think. Let me know if you have any questions. Let me know what you thought about just the general style of not using a camera on a camera arm to basically film everything with just either a head cam or a 360 camera or my cell phone. So let me know what you thought of that. If you're interested in checking out the Spartan Forge app, I do have a separate video for that where I go in a lot more detail. And I also have a discount code DIY that you guys can use for a discount on that app. So thanks for watching.